We're glad to have John Kean and Courtney Gould with us today to talk about audio streaming and particularly the AES recommendations that John Kean was the lead writer, I believe, at least chairman for. And so what are we going to do on streaming to make the audio sound better? Over to you, John.
Okay, thanks. And thank you very much for inviting me, Barry. It's really a great opportunity to be here. I was looking forward to it. And hi to all of you. A little trick there. So I was mentioning about joining NPR in 1980. And when I did, I remember having discussions with some of the other engineers there about a problem they had had since the beginning of NPR, which was inconsistent audio levels. Even though they had some of the best engineers in the country, programming would vary in loudness, particularly if it came from other sources. And NPR did get a lot of material from member stations around the country. And we talked and really never had a solution at the time. But I had the opportunity of participating in the European Broadcasting Union's PLOUD committee, which in the late 2000s was developing a set of recommendations, EBU tech reports on loudness. And I was fascinated with that and thought that it could be a solution for NPR. So I'm the one that introduced, or maybe you can say, you can blame me for introducing loudness measurement to NPR, which required a lot more meetings, a lot of slide presentations to sell the concept to audio engineering and to digital distribution and so on. But everybody came around and really embraced it. And it turned out to be just the solution that NPR was looking for. Before I left, I wrote the technical standards for online audio and specified an automatic normalizer where all audio content, and this includes hundreds of files per day, come into a receiving server at NPR, and they are automatically normalized to -24 LUFS. They're also analyzed for dynamic range, and although seldom is adjustment needed, but it can do that as well and adjust the loudness range. So it was a great help. And around 2014, I think it was, the Audio Engineering Society Broadcast and Online Delivery group decided they wanted to establish a set of technical recommendations for applying loudness. And I see that my friend and colleague David Bialik is here today. David is the chair of the Broadcast and Online Technical Committee for the AES, which sponsored or hosted the group that wrote the recommendations. And David has been an active participant in that writing process. So, hi, David. I don't see you up on my screen at the moment, but I know you're in there somewhere.
Hello, John.
Hi there. So, what I wanted to talk about is a new technical document, which we just completed after more than a year and a half of work. It's TD 1008, and it addresses, we hope, all of the questions and issues that were related to the original TD 1004. And we tried to make it even more applicable to any services that put audio on the internet. So that includes streaming, podcasts, which are huge these days, and on-demand file playback, which includes music services. This is just a slide to show that I used at the an AES presentation to show how big online audio has become a more than $10 billion a year industry. And we're only talking about audio for online, not to be confused with audio for video, which has already been worked out and resolved and is working very well. But online audio is a different matter. It's still kind of the Wild West, and we want to help not only minimize differences in loudness between sources, but we also want to improve the quality, as Barry mentioned. Here's the group of distinguished people who were on the drafting group. Some really great organizations there, as you see, too. David likes to point out that we wound up shortly into the start of the process working with 2 meetings a week, not to mention all the emails and phone calls that went on as well. So a huge amount of work was put into this. This is just to point out that we're talking about the audio delivery chain that is tasked with normalization of content loudness. We already talked about the fact that it's for audio. So here's, excuse me, some of our primary goals. It was to establish appropriate loudness for streaming and on-demand file playback. And it's based on the ITU recommendation BS 1770, which in the mid-2000s introduced the ITU Loudness Meter. So we're trying to optimize distribution and the loud listener experience, pardon me, provide that consistent real-time production loudness target, which we'll get into in a bit, consistency of loudness, and preventing unnecessary peak limiting. And I just mentioned in a bullet item there about audio metadata, which we'll touch on at the end. Here's table 1 from the document. It's really the heart of the document, and it's fairly complex. It took me about a half a dozen slides to explain this table, which I don't think I'll take the time to do here. But one of the concepts that we used was the introduction of album and track normalization, something that probably most of you haven't heard about yet. So what we're going to do here is start with an album with, let's say, 4 songs that are at different loudness, integrated loudness levels, as indicated by these dotted brown lines here. And you can see that some are louder and some are softer, which is what we would expect in an album. The artists intend some songs to play softer than others. Now with album normalization, watch what the bars do on this. All of the songs are, in this case, reduced to a target loudness, and they're all done in unison. The idea here with album normalization is to maintain that same track-to-track variation the way the original album was made. That preserves the artist's intent and we think provides the best experience for listeners. However, that's not so easy to do for radio-style streams, where you use an audio processor and everything kind of comes out the toothpaste tube at about the same loudness. So we refer to that as track normalization. That's where each track gets normalized to the same target. So all those brown lines line up here. That's something we're used to doing, but we don't consider it optimal because it makes everything sound alike. We made a simpler table in the document, table 2 you see here, and this really applies best to what, again, I would call radio style streams, such as these formats here, because these are formats when they're done in live distribution, live production, where you don't have the opportunity to do proper normalization. So we have these single loudness values for the entire stream measured over a period of time. And they're associated with these primary formats. So if it's primarily speech, we recommend a distribution integrated loudness of -18 LUFS, or loudness units relative to full scale. If it's primarily popular music, we recommend a track normalization of -16 LUFS. Now, you'll notice there's a 2 LU difference between these. That's because speech and music, as indicated by the ITU loudness meter, has a 2 or 3 LU offset. They don't indicate speech and music at the same level for the same perceived loudness. So what we've done here is say, if you have the ability to control speech separately from music, that you normalize it 2 LU lower than popular music. That provides a more natural matching between speech and music. But if you have a mixed format where it's all together, then we recommend splitting the difference. So we're trying to make this easy to implement. And by the way, sports is also at -17. Drama, being primarily speech, is -18. One thing that's important to keep a note on here is that this document is part of an evolutionary process. And we're actually evolving toward a future system, which we hope will only be 2 or 3 years off, where loudness will be managed by audio metadata embedded in the frames of the audio. And this is a transfer of data from the encoder to the decoder. It is not our familiar ID3 metadata that's popular for audio tagging, where you add song title and artist. That kind of metadata is not intended for precise time synchronization, but the MPEG-D audio metadata that I'm talking about here is actually transferred in synchronization with the audio at high speed, frame by frame. It's already in use in audio production and distribution. Some of you have set-top boxes where maybe you found the control buried way down in the settings, where you can select the dynamic range for your desired listening environment. So if you're in a quiet living room and you want to hear the full dynamics, you can turn that on. If you don't want to disturb your spouse or significant other, there's a late night environment setting in MPEG-D. If you are in a noisy environment, there's a setting by that name, which shrinks the dynamic range. So if you're listening to audio in the car, or maybe even more on a bus, listening on earbuds, where you want to hear all of the program and not miss anything, the noisy environment DRC control will manage that for you. And until that metadata is added to online content, streams, podcasts, and files. What we're recommending is a process that is currently well suited for both fixed and mobile listening. And we're looking toward that future day. We also talk about in the document audio metadata, so that we're in the process of introducing it for people and hoping to raise awareness of it. I think audio metadata is going to be the next revolution in audio, because it will allow you to, at your choice, hear the full dynamic range of the content as it was originally produced. But if you're in a kitchen and you're on a little portable and you want to hear all of the material with all the background noise, you can select a setting for that. The document also has a lot of helpful notes. So I'll go on here to try and give you a little demonstration. This is from another slide deck, which I prepared for the NRSC conference. And I took a 1 minute clip from some music that was written and produced by Sean Singh at Google, who is a member of our AES writing group, and really a bright young fellow to write this music. Anyway, it was just right because, as you'll see here from the waveform envelope, it starts out at a moderate level, has a little burst of sound, and then it drops down, and then it begins rising in volume over that minute to kind of a bang finish. What I'm going to do is play this, or at least part of this, original, so you can hear what it sounds like in its original form, if I've got the settings right. So Barry, just go on and yell at me if I didn't turn on the audio. So let's see. By the way, don't change your audio volume. Try and keep this one down just a bit, because it'll get 10 dB louder at the end of the third slide. Okay, I'm going to stop there and just back up to the same slide again. So that was an integrated loudness at -24 LUFS, which is the loudness that is standardized for all video production in North America. In Europe and other parts of the world, they use -23, which is almost the same. But that isn't very, very loud if you're going to be in a noisy environment. So we'll get to that in a sec. The loudness range, by the way, measured 14.8 loudness units, or dB, if you like. Okay, here's the same piece of audio. And by the way, the way I prepared this is with the Fraunhofer software development kit. So it was encoded at low bit rate, including audio metadata. It was then sent to the decoder, decoded, and any MPEG-D processing was performed on it by my selection, as we're using here. It was then converted back to a WAV file, so we can play it here. But this can be done in real time in a live stream. So in this case, I've told the decoder did nothing to the audio stream itself. Still the original audio sent to the decoder. Only the decoder's been told to raise the loudness to -18, which you can see has increased the loudness. It actually is performing some peak limiting, although you don't see much of it in this waveform sketch. But there is a digital look-ahead limiter in the decoder. So let's hear what it sounds like when we've told the decoder to increase it by 6 LU. So if you were using a small device to play back your audio, you'd probably want greater loudness in order to ensure that you can drive the loudspeaker, and you'd probably want that slight reduction in loudness range. Okay, and then here's the third slide where I've told the decoder to really raise the loudness from -24 up 10 LU approximately. And if you look, it's not too hard to see that there's quite a bit of compression and limiting going on in this. This would be, I think, just great for playback in a noisy environment, particularly with content that has dynamic range. Whoops, wrong button. It's a cute song he wrote. It's only part of it, but it's a great piece for demonstrating this. And did you notice the difference in dynamic range? It certainly got louder, but it couldn't have gotten louder unless there had been active processing in the decoder, which was under my control and could be under your control. So it's really I think a major step forward in your being able to decide how much management you want of the loudness of the content and its dynamic range. Maybe not quite like having an Orban Optimod or a Telos Omnia in your player device, but if you're interested in hearing all the audio with high quality, I think this is the solution. And audio metadata will also identify the loudness of every piece of audio content, whether it's a podcast or a stream or a file, and will allow the decoder to manage those. So if you're driving your car and you switch from a stream to a podcast, you're not lurching for the volume control, trying to adjust the level. The audio metadata and the metadata software in your player will take care of that difference in loudness. So there are a number of advantages, I think, to this. So I'll drop out of that and come back to the Zoom. So what all do you think? Any comments, questions?
On the difference you had in the LUFs for sports as opposed to voice, was that difference due to background in the sports and excitement, or why was it so different?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, we were we figured that sports did include sort of a mixed content, and that therefore we gave it that margin of 1 LU louder. After all, everyone wants to be able to hear the sports.
How does the metadata, how is that an improvement over just giving the user a compression control to set based upon the noise in their environment?
Well, I mentioned that the metadata is actually sent continuously to the decoder. It's created in the encoder. So it's important to keep in mind the encoder is still sending untouched audio data to the listener. You can hear it in its original form. The difference in having a processor in the player, which doesn't use metadata, is that it doesn't know anything about the loudness of the incoming audio. So it can't normalize the way a system that knows the upstream measurement in LUFS is for each piece of content. So it can't do matching as well. There's also, at least in my vision, an opportunity here to build a more sophisticated audio processor at the encoder. I mentioned an Orban Optimod. We can't afford to have a device like that in our phone or music player, but someone generating a stream could easily put that software around the encoder, and that kind of sophisticated processing could be selected by the listener, and therefore you could turn it on and turn it off at your will.
Mm-hmm.
Have
John?
you talked to Orban about that? Because their prices are high because they sell just, maybe thousands of their devices. Here you'll be talking about millions and millions.
John, may I take that question?
Sure, go ahead, David.
First off, that this paper was edited by John, but Bob Orban was a major contributor, and he actually contributed a lot of that section. Also, the one thing that John alluded to but didn't say flat out is that by having the metadata in there, it will also sort of recreate the artist's intent of how they want the audio presented. And many of the music services are actually adopting this already. John, if you saw the news, I believe Apple is already building it into their Apple Music player now.
That's right. They've already taken that step. And yeah, you saw Bob Orban's name on the writing group for the technical document. And yeah, he was a great help in the writing. Yeah, I have mentioned this to Bob, but I think for audio processor companies who are used to selling hardware and software, it might be a bit of a competition to do the processing for consumers. So I don't know whether that'll ever work out for them. But
you're talking about ultimately having several choices for the consumer.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. So you could you could select maybe from a variety of different processes.
Corny?
Yeah, I was gonna say when you do use processing, you have to keep all this in mind with the loudness units, because you're going to want to process a lot, very different from what you do for radio. So if you go in with a radio mindset and you just crush everything and say, I'm going to crush it so that it's, minus 16 LUFS for the music, what you're going to end up is something that's going to sound really bad and really dull. So for people adjusting processing through something like this, you have to open your mind to allow more dynamic sounding content, which in my opinion comes along with better sounding audio for the end user. So you have to be, it'll be a challenge to use if you try to think about radio the way radio has always been thinking about it, or has been thinking about it for decades. but it opens the door for much more creative use for processing that, with things that could work with the intent of the artist versus against it. So there's an opportunity here to move beyond the sound that radios had. And I would encourage folks to really think about that, because in the younger generations, they're not listening to radio very much. And a lot of them, when they hear radio, to them, it sounds like AM to people my age in the 80s. It's, even though to us, it sounds great because we're used to it. But my kid will say, why do you listen to that? It sounds bad. And you hear other people, and it's just, they don't get it because they know what these songs sound like. They're hearing it on the streaming services. So it's a paradigm shift for anybody who's doing mass entertainment for,
Yeah, but Corny, the question is, do they really know what it's supposed to sound like? I mean, we're talking about the MP3 generation.
Well, you're talking about AAC and things that are much better than
right.
MP3, but that is still closer to the artist's intent than anything the radio's putting out.
So will this encourage greater bit depth possibly than guaranteed more than 16 bits, at least 24-bit depth? So you do have that quality that you can use if you keep your intentional compression down, obviously in the end user end of the situation. It's interesting because this is the opposite of what we had in the analog days, where you actually companded and compressed a lot to improve signal to noise ratio and then reversed it in the final playout.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you needed to, because you had modulation rules to comply, and you had to overcome over-the-air noise. A digital system, even a modest bit rate stream, is still a 16-bit depth audio system having about a 96 dB dynamic range. So yes, you could go to 24 bits, but 16 bits is still a lot of dynamic range. And I think that from what I'm hearing in some of the points here, I wanted to say that more and more younger people are turning to higher quality audio.
Yes.
If you think about it, all of the on-demand music that we get these days over the internet is unprocessed audio. It is the original audio ripped from the master recordings that were distributed. So they are compressed by the producers, because that's still popular, but they do no further processing. What we've done in radio is what I call hyper compression. We've taken already compressed audio from CDs and file downloads, and then we process them again to put them on the air. And that has, I think, gone overboard.
Yes.
And I would argue that it probably has gradually pushed some listeners away. I wrote an article a year ago for Radio World, kind of lamenting this hypercompression and the loss of dynamic range in broadcast audio, and asked the question whether anyone still considers FM to be a high fidelity medium. I'm sure, like me, you were people buying, high fidelity tuners. Some people paid hundreds of dollars for Marantz receiver because it had a prized AM tuner built into it. These days, people don't think of AM anymore, and yet the technical performance of FM transmitters is even better today than it ever was.
Exactly.
But it's audio.
John, you had a nice slide that you showed me the other day. That
you want me to find
please,
that?
Would you bring that up? And Corny,
it.
while he's doing that, I'm going to raise this issue because you're perfectly in the middle. You have worked on some of the best audio processors in the biggest markets with the $14,000 price tag. And now you're talking about audio streaming, where you want to let the artist's understanding really shine through. And so you really have one foot in each world, and I think are able to express this in a very interesting way.
Yeah, one of my frustrations that I've had is when you develop audio processing, when we make improvements to the processing, the intent of the improvement is not to make it so that you can be louder. The intent was to get better quality at the loudness level you're at, and try to let more of that intent comes through. But the marketplace being what it is, hey, I can get another dB out of this, and you're kind of back at where you started from. So that's always been kind of a frustration, that I've had on the analog side, where it's like it doesn't have to be, the gains you're fighting now are not that perceivable to the audience for the most part. So you're just kind of finding more room to kind of trash it up. I'm not saying you in this group, but I'm just saying that the collective you of the broadcast programming people.
We're all guilty.
So there's a part of me that, it's like, well, if people would just wind out a little bit, the radio would sound, more competitive, in my opinion, to the younger people.
Absolutely.
So now I'm in a situation here, I'm involved with podcasts, and I'm doing podcasting, and I'm in that space, and I'm, work with things with streaming, and I can hear how much better you can get with, if we just kind of hold back on some of that mashing that people have a tendency to do. So I got excited about the AES recommendations coming out, because the numbers they're picking really allows you to have that freedom to flexibility. I mean, you could still make it sound smash, but you're not going to benefit from it. You'll just sound quieter compared to someone who's more dynamic,
I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, and that's a good point, Courtney. We aren't indicating to anyone how they should process their audio, only that they target the loudness values that we specify, and that does not have anything to do with how you process. But we hope that that's going to provide enough headroom or crest factor so people will gradually take advantage of that and reduce some of the peak limiting that they do. I found that.
And that, unfortunately, is all left over from program directors and sales managers from the old AM days, where your loudness made your signal go farther. And unfortunately, when we went to FM, they all still said, well, we got to be louder than the competition, even though it didn't make your signal go any farther. And it just got embedded. And unfortunately, that's always been a problem.
Yeah, it is. That's true of recorded music too. Maybe some of you have seen these analysis. In fact, one member of our committee, Ilko Grimm, who lives in the Netherlands, did an automated study of hundreds of thousands of songs going back around 40 years. And he's able to show the loudness of recorded music just getting progressively louder and louder. Even though it might have been rock music at one time or rock and roll, but it actually had a greater dynamic range than the music today by far. So it's quite a change.
Way back, we're talking about processing and some of the things there. Back in the 70s, I was involved with some discussions where we were talking about ways to convey to the FM listener a more pristine signal, something that is closer to the recording, but still maintain your modulation limits, stay above the noise floor, and make it sound good in a car. And we came to the conclusion that the best way to do that was to, and again, we're talking analog, totally analog technology at the time, have something in your, maybe in your subcarrier, carrying a, shall we call it a key, that would tell how much processing you're applying and what kind of processing, so that a smart decoder at the other end could be dialed to anywhere from full compression to minimal compression. And it, I mean, theoretically, it should work.
Yeah, wouldn't that be wonderful, Gordon? And it's
But-
technically feasible. Unfortunately, HD radio might have had the opportunity to do that, and they didn't. And since it's a lockdown system, there's really no way to add it now.
Right.
However, DAB Plus, the competitor to HD radio, does have metadata capability and can do just what I was demonstrating here today. And you have the ability to select the dynamic range right now with your over-the-air broadcasts if you live in Europe and listen
I'm
to
still wondering though, can't you just do that without the metadata? Just you have a
It doesn't
compressor in
work.
the receiver.
It's not, it doesn't give you the proper decoding.
Right. It just never works as well to try and compress audio and then figure out a way to expand it again
Right.
later, or even
The
try
only
to
thing that came
compress
close
it.
was the BBX compression.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The dynamic noise reduction they had.
Whatever it was called.
Yeah.
I think instead of compressing and then decompressing, it'd be best to just send it uncompressed and then apply compression at the receiver.
Exactly, because you've got that 96 dB dynamic range digital linear audio channel. So why not send it in its original form? If it was recorded that way, then why not transmit it out to the listener that way? And then you use the metadata kind of bookended around the encoder and decoder to send the commands, which allow the listener to process the audio the way they want.
And
If
some
I
of
may-
these newer cars have a automatic, like an old-fashioned loudness control.
Oh,
That
some of
you've
them are-
got multiple levels, and I don't know if they're connected to the speedometer or what. It's supposed to compensate for ambient noise and speed and all that.
Yeah.
Is this in on this newfangled stuff?
I hope not, because there's like all kinds of versions of that. And when I
They
was in the
sound
car,
terrible.
yeah, I would always wonder what's
I-
wrong with the radio, and I
Yeah.
would just end up turning it off, So I hope they don't do that. That's
Yeah.
just
What
I-
a lot of people have forgotten is that when in the loudness wars, and Corny, I think you'll agree with me, that a lot of people have forgotten that clarity beats loudness any day of the week.
yes.
And the whole thing with the loudness war goes back to the string dial, where if you were moving your
Mhm.
tuner, and if you were the loudest on the dial, people would stop and say, "Oh, I got good reception. That's it."
Yes.
And because they were confusing reception with loudness and reception, and that's one thing that's
Right.
hurting us today. Now, the one thing about the AES paper, number one, I want to let everyone know it's a free download. You do not have to pay for it. And I just put the link up in the chat so you can get it. So there's no charge for that, since it's an AES technical document and not a standard. There is no charge.
It was also in
Um,
your article that we posted last week. The link was there.
Yeah, that too. I just never read myself. But I just wanted to let you guys know that the work is not stopping. There will be more work done, and we're hoping that the next paper that comes out hopefully will mention about metadata and loudness control. And I know John has volunteered, because I volunteered him already for that committee. And hopefully, Corny, we can get you to join it too.
Okay.
And now you guys know what I've been working on for the last 2 years. And remember that I want everyone to understand, John Kean actually volunteered to be editor, and you have no idea how much work that poor man had to go through. We were sitting for 4 hours every week talking about loudness. And granted, I'm not the smartest person, but a lot of the people in the room were. And it was amazing how he kept everything in pace, and he should get a round of applause. So thank you, John.
Oh,
Yes.
thank you so much, David.
Indeed.
Yeah, it was a pleasure working with that group, and it wasn't too hard keeping everybody in agreement, but we actually managed to minimize our arguments and come out with a good result. By the way, I should mention, since David didn't, that we're also now working on an AES website on loudness. It is going to be the Loudness website, and it'll have tutorials and instructional parts. It'll have in-depth information, the sort of learn more sections you can go to, and video with experts in the industry talking about how they apply loudness in their work. And that'll be out before the end of the year, at least in a beta form, and we'll continue to add material to it. So I'm really excited about that.
Well, I'm saying that it's going to be out by, we're hoping by February or later. End of the year, I'm still not seeing being realistic.
Will that
Well,
website be free or paid?
The website,
Everything, all of our work will be open to the public.
right. And so, yeah, well, we're hoping this will really excite people to apply these recommendations. Barry, I have that
Good.
picture up. So if you like, I'll go ahead.
Please. Absolutely.
Okay, let's see, go back to basic here and find it. Here we are. There we are. So do you all see it?
Mm-hmm.
This is actually a 2-page spread from Broadcasting Magazine in 1946. And I just love it because it was an ad for the General Electric FM transmitter line. And here's down here at the bottom, a 50 kilowatt FM transmitter right after World War II that was available. Look at the number of cabinets it took.
It's about the size of a semi-truck.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It was a monster.
And you never have to pay heating bills again.
Yeah.
That's true.
What frequencies were they on?
At the
FM.
time, they had just adopted, the FCC had adopted the new 88 to 108 megahertz band. So it was all ready for that band. And what they were trying to demonstrate here with their headline, FM does it, says more than double the dynamic range of AM radio. And to do that, they showed an example with really quite a thoughtful chart, a dynamic range scale with AM radio only providing not quite 30 dB of dynamic range. Of course, I wish today that was still possible. But anyway, that's what they were saying was technically possible. But FM was able to go from just over a whisper up to, very loud, about 80 dBA. So it was probably 55 dB dynamic range, double that of AM. And the text here is just wonderful to read because they talk about, the threshold of hearing to the crash of thunder. And they were so proud of being able to finally have a system and a transmitter product that could deliver that. So to them, they thought dynamic range was what FM was for, or at least one of the advantages. And I was saying to Barry earlier this week that in talking about what people think of FM these days, that we really don't think of FM in these terms anymore, as being a high fidelity medium with all the dynamic range that you would like to hear in your home.
But there are reasons for that. I mean, the pre-emphasis
like
curve.
stereo multiplexing.
No, besides that, the pre-emphasis curve ruined it. If you think about it, Armstrong, when he originally demonstrated FM modulation, it was not pre-emphasized. And once you added pre-emphasis so that you could get rid of some of the hiss, you were sort of okay until sound recording and reproduction caught up to the point where you had all this high frequency energy, all these partials being recorded properly, orchestral and otherwise, like cymbal crashes. And then all of a sudden, boy, that preemphasis is causing a problem. And we have to have limiters and compressors so that we don't overmodulate at the same time. And voila, your great dynamic range and frequency response went all to heck.
And
Yeah,
that went
and-
to multi-band.
Yeah.
And
The,
I would say too,
and
the pre-emphasis came about from what I remember in the history of it. It came about from the desire to not have to spend so much making very linear demodulators in the radio, because the ones
Well-
that they end up using have a lot of high, like the triangle noise is really bad as you went up in frequency. So
Isn't though in general audio has less high frequency content, and we're used to that. And if you've got a channel with white noise, then it is beneficial to roll off the highs on the receive side and boost them on the transmit side. We had that in tape, we have that in phonographs, we have that in FM.
Yep, you're absolutely right, Hal. The intention when preemphasis was adopted was to complement what they thought was the natural roll-off in high-frequency content. And actually, at the time it was adopted, due to the microphone techniques and the recording techniques and the kind of music, there was a fairly significant roll-off, and 75 microseconds wasn't too bad. They obviously got by without any severe effects initially, but times advanced and the hyping of high frequencies became greater, and then it at 75 microseconds was excessive.
CBS
And,
Volumax, if you recall, was one of the early solutions to some extent for preemphasis.
Yeah, and Dolby studied this when they introduced a noise reduction system for FM using Dolby B mode, and they used a 25 microsecond preemphasis, which they studied and found was a better match to the roll-off of audio content about 40 years ago. And then to that was added the Dolby B. And that system then together produced about a 75 microsecond preemphasis equivalent. So if you had a non-decoding receiver, it sounded roughly the same as if you'd used fixed 75 microseconds.
We had that on the air, and it actually sounded quite good.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Even with the possibly excessive boost of 75 microsecond preemphasis, it seems as though the overall RMS level could be brought down so that you don't have to clip or compress the highs. Although it'd be interesting to know how far down it would have to go. I did in the 1970s run an FM station with, I think it was a Langevin compressor, and with our peak flasher hitting 100%, the meter on the front of the Bell R showed about 25 or 30% modulation.
John, I'd like to raise this issue, and before we have some folks that will have to leave for their afternoon work, we talked about this a little bit. You mentioned it on your slide, MPEG-D, and we talked about the evolution from MP3, which was, did you say 79, through AAC in 95, and now MPEG-D, that differs from MPEG-4?
Correct. Yeah, MPEG-D is a dynamic range control system. The one that we anticipate will be implemented along with this metadata, because MPEG-D does use metadata. And let me see.
So it's sort of parallel with AAC plus and HLS. It's not the successor, or is it?
It's not like MP3, I hope.
No, MP3 is just a a digital encoding and decoding system with lossy compression to save bit rate.
Save
MPEG-D does
space.
not get involved in the bit rate at all. It's only there to define how audio is handled. And if you give me a second, I can put up the other slide. I can show you what that, here we go. Let's see if I turn on.
Eilish, does anybody kind of know where I'm going with files that look like they are a crew cut from 1960 in terms of just the processing is mashed almost or at the point or perhaps beyond the point of clipping? And what do you do with that? That's a frequent topic of discussion in a variety of engineering and radio groups that I'm in. I'm curious about what can be done with the system that you've described today to take that to the producers and say, look, can you give us some things with dynamic range and perhaps implement what you're doing at the production level in the creative side of it with some of these tools so that we don't get files that look like they are, you know.
Well, none of that is going to matter at all if radio continues to do what it does, because most music people don't bother with radio anymore. John, I see you've got the slide up.
Yeah.
Barry, if I could just interject here, Ted, I can tell you right now, the people from NARIS are very excited about this paper and they're behind us 100%. So the Grammy organization is looking at it.
So this illustrates what I was talking about, where you have an encoder on the left and audio comes in and this is the lossy encoder. At least usually that would be the case. At the same time, the audio is fed to a dynamic range control analyzer, sort of the front end of your audio processor. And then those processing commands are turned into digital data, which is added to the audio, but the audio is never touched. It just rides in the audio frames on a low level. It's sent over the internet, or it's embedded in a file like a podcast, and then the decoding, the lossy decoder, converts it back to audio. It also pulls out the dynamic range control data and feeds that back to processors that can implement dynamic range control, normalizing the loudness to a desired value suitable for your player, so you don't overload your player's audio amplifier, for example. And any errors that occur, overshoots in the DRC process, are followed by this look-ahead digital limiter, which is just there protectively, and then it feeds the audio out. So we were talking about producers. This part of the process could be moved back to the content creator. So in the studio, they could make decisions about how they want the audio to be handled as one of the options for encoding and then decoding and playback. So it's certainly possible for content creators to be involved in this process. Initially, it will just be their existing content as it's received going through DRC. But I see this moving back pretty quickly as content creators and producers say, hey, I could tailor this to get just the effect I wanted for people who want dynamic range control. So there are a lot of nice options for this system.
And
So the dynamic control is actually a pilot of sorts. It's telling the other end how to behave.
That's right. because the data that goes from here to here is untouched. It is the pristine original data. No change in level, dynamics, anything. It's only the silent data, kind of like a pilot data, that rides with the audio and then can be used at your discretion.
It lets the user have the control. And I like your last line down there at the bottom, you didn't get a chance to talk about, for people that want to prevent cymbal crashes or gunshots from waking up their mate at night.
Right. And this actually works extremely well. If anybody's ever turned it on and listened to it, you can't hear the control. Probably most of you watch Netflix, right? And Netflix has actually a target loudness of -27 LUFS, which is way down there. And the reason is they want to be able to produce their expensive shows and series with high dynamic range. They don't want anything to restrict it. If you play it back in its original form, it's wonderful if you've got a high-powered amplifier and good speakers in a quiet room. But if, as Barry was saying, if you're trying to listen to a movie with explosions or people shouting when someone's next door asleep, then you want the late night mode, because it will reduce those loud sounds, and it works seamlessly. You cannot hear the artifacts of that control. That MPEG-D is very good, and all we're proposing is the same thing for consumers with their audio.
This picture is interesting. It does remind me of one that I did explaining how cinema immersive audio works, where instead of having audio pre-panned through a 7.1 system and then transmitting the 8 channels, they actually transmit up to 128 mono audio fragments along with panning instructions. And then the panning is done in the auditorium for up to 64 or however many speakers are there. So this thing of passing the instructions to the playback device is interesting.
Yeah, it really is. And it requires high speed. Those instructions have to be sent continuously to the decoder along with the audio, and it has to be frame accurate. There can't be any chance that the audio is being adjusted 20 or 50 milliseconds off from the sound. Right. So it is frame accurate data. And that's the challenge with ID3 data. It was really designed just to send you things like song title and artist, or maybe a picture, a thumbnail of the album cover. And often that data was sent in the header of a file, but is not really well suited to this kind of control. Greg Oganowski is working on a solution for that, but I would say he's got a real uphill battle to get the timing perfect. So we'll see how he does with that.
I guess my question would be, what is the resolution? It's certainly not sample by sample, because then you have to have too much data.
It's frame by frame, and that is only it's very small. It's on the order of 1,000 or 2,000 samples. It's that tiny, and the sample rate is might be 48,000 times a second. So you're talking about frames at a high rate containing these instructions. They're small enough so we can't hear any timing error.
Okay, so it's not going to seriously affect transient response?
Nope, it knows ahead of time that there's a transient coming. That's the beauty of this. The decoder is actually told in advance so that it makes the adjustments before we ever hear it.
And don't forget too, it's all in terms of loudness normalization. So you don't want to be messing around with the peaks on that, because that throws all that out the window. So yeah, you want to, yeah, so the peaks have to be preserved to, you know,
Uh-huh.
to all work right and not sound funny.
Yep, that's right. And
But
Would
you,
you-
but you do have that, at least in the processor you showed, you do have that peak protection final limiter as well.
Yeah, and that doesn't really, like when you get into the loudness normalization stuff, if you do it right, the peak limiter will only really kick in maybe a dB or two at the most, depending on what, you know, it'll only go nuts if you get the loudness wrong, but you know, the loudness calculation's wrong.
that's right. So in an earlier slide, I showed the Advanced Television Systems Committee, the ATSC 1 system, used the, audio metadata from the get-go. And the encoding included measurement of the audio, which was embedded into the audio before transmission, and then sent over the air or over a cable. And then the receiver pulled out the loudness control data and applied it to the audio decoding. And that's been around now for almost 20 years and works seamlessly. So it was developed with Dolby Laboratories as the AC3 system. And it works beautifully. By the way, you'll notice that they use the word dial norm because I don't know if you knew it, but in television, the voice dialogue is, again, what establishes the target level. If there's a mix of music and sound effects, those are actually filtered out in the loudness measurement. And this is a case where the production process is directly involved in defining the sound of the end result. They use calibrated monitors that produce a specific sound pressure level for a particular loudness level, and mixing is done to that calibrated monitor speaker system, and it's anchored to dialogue. And then everything else that gets added, like music, is all relative to that. And that's exactly the way they're doing it for over-the-top video with all of the streaming services that we watch now, like Disney Plus and Netflix. They are all using a dial norm based system, a different kind of metadata platform. It's MPEG-D instead of ATSC1, but MPEG-D is what we think will be the next revolution in audio.
Earlier, when you were talking about movie video, you said USA has minus 24 LUFS and Europe has minus 23.
Mm-hmm.
Why do they always have to be different?
Well, they could say that about us because they really came up with it.
Then why are we always different?
Because we're just that way, I think. It's really a barely noticeable difference. So
Yeah.
Content is pretty interchangeable, but that's just what they came up with, and works well.
I can give you one example in the podcast world where, you know, you've got the Amazon standard, which is, you know, minus 16, of course, but their maximum peak level is minus 2 dB. So, and that's their standard for their speakers. So if you're targeting that, then that'll work great for that. But then another service, you'll be 2 dB hotter on something that's going for the whole 0 dB if you normalize it there. So a lot of us just split the difference between the two, and it seems to work, and nobody complains. So,
yep, that's true.
For cinema, there's supposed to be the standard of approximately minus 20 dBFS pink noise, resulting in an 85 dBc SPL at the reference listening position, which is about 2/3 of the way back in the room. But the movies keep getting louder and louder, so the cinemas have to keep turning it down.
Is that because the theaters are getting smaller?
No, because they're calibrated. Still, that reference listening position would be 85 dBc. I don't know. I think the movie producers are going deaf.
Well, you start out with the record grooves getting so wide that they'd skip on jukeboxes. Then you got CDs that are all clipped out before you get them. So why not the movie theater? So people need earmuffs.
Yeah.
The
One
thing
of
with
the reasons
records, I
we
think,
started the committee was, and this was before John even joined, because we started this committee probably around 1996, targeting on loudness in general, and then we split off on television, streaming, and so forth. But if you remember the old Maxell ad with the guy sitting in the chair with the glass, and suddenly something would get so loud that it'd blow the glass away. If you listen to streaming maybe 6-7 years ago, and then the commercials would come in 6 to 7 dB hotter than the content, that's when I said, okay, we need to have this work on streaming. And that's when we started with TD 104, and now it's at 108. And I was lucky enough to beg and plead John to join the committee to help us get this done.
Well, they outlawed it on TV, but they kept doing it.
Guess what? The COM Act did work for television for the most part, and the Congresswoman Issue has contacted the AES about trying to work on some sort of COM Act for streaming now.
Now, wouldn't a lot of that, it's my impression, a lot of those loudness differences you have are from basically like head-end systems that are injecting commercials in, and not from the broadcaster itself.
Right.
Correct, Corny. But the problem is, especially with radio streaming, let's since most of us are radio broadcasters here, you have your content being produced. It's then going up to your CDN. Your CDN is then injecting ads from multiple sources, and no one is thinking about normalizing.
Right.
I know when I ran the streaming department for radio.com, we were sending all of our content at a -17, and all the commercials coming in from the CDN were a -18, and that was working.
Right.
And everybody was happy. But
I was talking
moved in,
about,
and no one seems to be doing that anymore.
Yeah, I was talking more about the COM Act with TV, but you're right about the streaming when they splice in things and
Back in the late 60s, when people were first getting involved and upset about the level of modulation, this is, of course, when we were burning out the modulation transformers and AM transmitters. There was a guy up in Phoenix on KTAR, and he worked on the TV as a weatherman, and he had this voice that he could control, and it sounded louder than anything else. And so they used him on a lot of spots just for that reason.
I wonder how he would turn out with a loudness meter.
It was higher when Potomac Instruments first came out with their dynamic range meter. He'd get right up there and he'd be in the 2 dB range with his own voice.
That's funny.
We're talking about speech asymmetry. You know,
he was able to somehow control his own voice so that voice just sat right in this little narrow range. And
the human compressor.
He was
no asymmetrical modulation from his voice. Okay.
Yeah, he was using the waveform efficiently, I think. So you all may like to get a loudness meter and start taking a check on some content. This little one you see sitting here is this all is actually clipped from a Audacity editor window, and this is a VST plugin called DP Meter 4. So if you want to do it in Audacity, download the DP4 VST plugin, and you'll have this display, and you'll see there's the integrated loudness. So this content had already been normalized to the target. And we can look at loudness range here, 14.8, and the true peak maximum level was -6. So even though this doesn't look like it's flattened to the limits, there's really only 6 dB of margin in this audio. So you can get all of this data, including the short-term loudness, which is what you would probably want to use in mixing. If you wanted a kind of a replacement for a VU meter, you'd use short-term loudness, or momentary. Momentary is even faster, but short-term loudness is a pretty nice correlation to the smooth movement of a VU meter pointer.
When this gets going, will there be, I mean, and really developed and we advance it and everything, will there be add-on boxes where a program director can come in and start adjusting what the listeners hear?
Not without violating the AES recommendations, or maybe soon to become AES standards. So yeah, if they want to violate standards, they could.
And you could make a processor where you could do that and give them controls over what to do and still maintain that, the target, but it's not going to be the same effect that the program director is expecting, though.
Correct. And it's all measurable. So if somebody cheats, it's going to show up in the measurements and in the metadata.
Mm-hmm.
So you can kind of track down who did what by direct measurement.
And let me just correct John on one thing. This is only a recommendation right now. It is not a standard. We're hoping that someday it will be elevated to a standard, but there's much more process involved to elevate a recommendation to a standard.
Yep. But
the discussions have started.
Right. But we wouldn't mind if audio metadata kind of overtakes it before it becomes a standard, because metadata, as I think we've been discussing here, will solve so many problems we've had for many years, kind of like NPR's problems.
I believe I've got
question.
the
If you're
correct-
streaming with this system, is it compatible with legacy players? Like, can you listen to it on one amp? Or do you have to have listeners that are using that kind of stuff?
Well, the encoders that are out now, the extended high efficiency AAC from Fraunhofer, runs on all of the iOS and Android operating systems going back about 4 or 5 years. So at this point, the great majority of consumer devices are already capable of supporting audio metadata. All you need is a little bit of software to add to the player. So there's a control that says, well, I want the noisy environment mode, or no, I want the original audio. So it actually is very easy to implement. And I would expect certain music services will start offering that very soon.
Will the receivers have adjustments like tone controls or settings or?
Yeah, they'll have these step positions with names like late night and noisy environment or full range, and you just select the one you like. So if you're driving the car and you say, well, I've got a nice quiet car, I like full range, you can just select that. And if a podcast comes on and it's got a lot of range because it's maybe a fine arts performance, you could say, well, I want to reduce that to something smaller. So yeah, it should be very simple to operate, I think.
Ken, think of what's available now on the new modern televisions. It's probably going to be the same thing as the AVRs and modern TVs have now.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you have to look at all that on the screen with a remote control, and that's pretty hard to. I get lost when I'm sitting down in the easy chair doing that, much less driving a car.
Yeah,
You're going to get lost.
Yeah, cable set-top boxes have dynamic range control built in. My Roku box has it built in, but unfortunately, they buried those settings down 3 or 4 levels. So we're going to definitely have to work on manufacturers making those controls in audio devices easy to use and right up there, right up front, so that there's no hunting for it.
With
So there's a challenge for us. Sorry?
With cars becoming internet connected devices, Internet of Things, and the players that people are using to stream being connected to the internet, is there a benefit and a practical way, not necessarily right now, but off in the future, of providing user feedback to the stream source and perhaps backwards to the program content source about how they're adjusting their sound and what environments they're using it in?
I don't see why not. If it's a device like a cell phone that has a return channel to the sender, I don't see why they couldn't check to see anonymously, well, what do people prefer for this content or that content? Yep, I think that'd be an interesting study to see what people like.
Then you'd start receiving a stream of ads for whatever your style is.
Yeah.
Possibly. Oh, by the way, you all probably know about hybrid radio, the system to allow you to, in the car, allow your receiver to switch from over-the-air reception to stream if your over-the-air signal gets weak. And I'm talking with the consortium right now about the technical document and the loudness recommendations as being a solution for them, because what they're dealing with is how do we get the stream to match the level of the over-the-air audio when the receiver switches. It's even harder than with HD radio. So I'm talking with them about this because I see the technical document recommendations for normalization as a solution for them. So hopefully we'll be back in the future and be able to tell you the answer.
Very good, John. I sure appreciate your spending the time with us today and sharing this information.
My pleasure. I had a ball.
Yeah.
And you too, Corny. We're glad to have you because.
More question?
Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, sorry. Going back to, I think I missed it. Going back to table 2, though, where with the loudness measurements are intended to keep things at the same loudness, why in table 2 are there different levels shown for different formats?
Because they align better. Let me see if I can go back and find the table here. And tell you what, I'll just share the whole screen. There we go. So you're referring to like, were you asking about like the difference between news and pop music?
Well, yes. If the LUFS level is meant to make them comparable for loudness anyway, why is there a difference shown in that table?
Because you mean like hard rock and classic?
Actually, it has more to do with the difference that we hear between speech and music. And it's been found in some studies since the development of the ITU loudness meter that it is in error by about 2 to 3 LU between the perceived loudness of speech and music. When it was developed, most of the content that was used for development and testing was music of various types. And it turned out later that you actually need to lower the level of voice by about 2 to 3 LU to make it sound perceptually matched to the loudness of music. It's not our ears, it's just an artifact in the meter that needed correction. So we corrected in this technical document.
Right.
And then these other values were, this one, mixed format, is just a compromise between music and speech because it's mixed. And sports, we considered it to be a mixed format as well.
And to that point, like if you look at the BS 1770 documentation, if you're measuring mono, which voices tend to be, they recommend that you use about 3 dB lower on mono material than you would with stereo. So the voice stuff probably falls into that same error that they mentioned.
Yep, that's a bit of a complicated point, which we don't have time to go into here. But
yeah,
the in the
and that,
there are a
I'm
lot
sorry,
of
and that
data in here, and we do have a section on monophonic distribution because the ITU loudness meter is a multi-channel meter. It wasn't designed to measure a single channel, and so it errors if you do. So we address the question of, well, how do you read the meter if I'm going to do, let's say I could encode in monophonic. There's no reason why AAC and HEAAC can't be encoded monophonically. There you've only got one channel. So how do I measure that compared to a stereo encode? So we address that in here.
I'm going to ask what it may be considered a dumb question, but since I'm a dummy, I'll ask dumb questions. First of all, is that ITU meter available as a software download, or is that just a hardware item?
Most of them are software. Here's a software meter that's free. So both those meters I was showing, this one and the earlier one, you can go on the internet and download. This one can run as a standalone executable, or it can run as a VST plugin in an editor. What's
the name of that meter?
It's called K meter. So if you just do a Google search for K-meter, it's really quite a nice meter because it has a familiar bar graph display. You can choose colors, and then over here you can have it operate either in RMS mode or the ITU loudness meter mode.
Now here's the dumb question. You mentioned that the other one was a plug-in to Audacity. Now, how do I determine what my output level in Audacity is? Because I can adjust the output level. So where do you find a standard to use the meter on?
-24 would be the target. And so while you're, let's say, mixing audio and you have control of the gain of your channels, you can play and watch the meter move and measure, or in editors like Audacity, you can select the audio and then just have the meter at high speed measure the loudness of the entire block. And then if it turns out that it's above or below the target, you just make a gain adjustment accordingly. So it's pretty slick. So this meter, by the way, it doesn't provide you with the continuous measurement like the other meter that I showed, but it does also have a peak indicator. That little red bar right there goes up and down and shows you the true peak level at the same time you're watching loudness down here. So it's good to keep your eye on peak. It even has a little numeric indicator telling you for the last some period of time the highest peak in the waveform. So that K meter is very handy. Another meter that I recommend is also free. It's called the U-Lean loudness meter. So it's YOULEAN. And that is available as a plugin to audio editors. It's not a standalone meter, but it will give you a real-time display in a timeline. So you can watch the loudness over an hour if you would like, and you get a graphical output as well as all of the technical values, integrated loudness, maximum short-term loudness, all of those things. So ULean is a great meter. Oh, I beg your pardon. There is a standalone version and an executable. You can drop a file onto the meter in the standalone version, and it'll, at high speed, like 20 times the playing speed, it will measure the all of those parameters. So you can take an AA3 file or a WAV file, just drop it visually from your Windows mouse pointer right onto the ULean meter, and in a few seconds you'll have your measurement. So that's a nice solution. I sound like an advertiser for these, but they are great tools to have.
Well, I'd like to invite you to do a little short tech tip showing us those 3 or 4 that we can let folks see.
You mean like record a video clip?
Or just text, show us graphically what they look like, where to get them.
Sure.
I think I've found the meters that John's been referring to, and I've found them and put links in the chat. So if you want to go grab them, they are there.
Well, that helps folks here, but let's widen it out to the general community. So either John, if you're willing, or David or Corny or whoever, let's put together a little tech tip that's got these meters and where they are, and let's let folks know that they can plug them into Audacity or whatever.
It's a great idea. And thanks for posting that, Ted. Yeah, those do look like the right links for those.
Happy to do that. I also found another K meter that I don't know if it's the same meter, but it relates to music mixing. Little $49 plug-in. So by a gentleman who does music mastering. I can put that up if anybody's interested.
Yeah, as a good idea. As a tip, most of these meters have paid versions, and they add special features like dialogue normalization. So they will have software on board that actually senses speech and measures the integrated loudness only of the speech segments and ignore the music and sound effects. And they usually charge for that.
And that's fine. There's obviously people put a lot of effort and time into these things. And so here again, I like to expose this to the general broadcast and streaming audience, letting them know what's available, how to get to it.
Yep. Yeah, I see the Orban meter. That one's probably the oldest one around, and we all know that one. Mm-hmm. And it is a great meter for real-time monitoring. Although I wish that you could turn off some of the displays. For example, why would I want to watch a VU meter or a European peak program meter while I'm really trying to keep my eye on the loudness? Mm-hmm. So you can't turn them off, but it's a great meter otherwise. Well, I have to say, I'm sorry that I've got another meeting coming up that I'm going to have to scoot to.
Well, absolutely. Thank you for bringing this to us.
Very interesting.
My pleasure. I will look forward to joining your meeting again, Barry, and over time getting some feedback from you guys on your experience with it.
Absolutely. And Corny, thank you. Not chasing you away, but we're glad to have you here, and we're still doing this every Thursday, and we appreciate the expertise and the knowledge and the experiences you bring.
Oh gosh, thanks so much. Mm-hmm. All right, well, nice to see some of you again and meet some new faces. So
take care.
Take care. I'll be seeing you in a future meeting.
See you later.
Okay.